We're just going to get right into it and welcome our speakers to join with me. We are joined today by two senior education fellows from Gilder Lehrman American Institute of History, dear friend Ron Nash and his colleague John McNamara. So we'll wait for John to join us. And Ron, we have you on mute. Do you mind unmuting?
Oh, is that better? Okay.
Yes, much better. Well, welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here today. And we always start off our ReaganEDU chats with our mugs, you know, because this is just casual conversations. And I shared that I'm trying to drink more water, so I have my mason jar with me today. Ron, is there a story behind your mug?
There is. In another life, I used to do a lot of work with the U.S. Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command. And that brought me to a place like this. This is a place in the Netherlands called the Civics Center of Excellence. It's a Dutch-based but multinational NATO-based. It's a think tank, not an operational or a deploying type of unit. So it was nice to go there and do a lot of things in Holland and again, engage with partners around the world and stuff that we're actually going to talk about, which is civic education. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Ron. How about you, John? Any story behind your mug?
Well, it's like very commercial. I've always been a fan of LLB merchandise, and this was one of the things that I purchased probably about, I don't know, 12 or 13 years ago. So it doesn't have the historical context like Ron's does. So I apologize for that.
That's okay. I love camphor mugs. Those are super great. Well, we are so excited to be joined with, just two amazing historians and practitioners in both the civic and history field. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we're really here to talk about your new initiative, which is teaching history through civics.
Well, it's teaching civics through history.
Oh, sorry.
Both work fine.
Well, that's great. So teaching civics through history. I am a firm believer that you can actually probably teach any subject through history in that combination. But why don't, Ron, why don't we start with you? What was the motivation behind, these new units that you're coming up with?
Well, again, I think, nationwide, obviously, there's a lot of discussion about, both from the left, right, and center in terms of political ideology, that students don't know enough about civics, and that's probably true, and they probably don't know enough about history, and that's probably true. But our connection with Gilder Lehrman and again, history, the discussion was, well, maybe we can launch as a point of entry for a lot of discussion on things that engage students and engage in a civic way, so that projects would also ensue from this. So study history, raise civil questions. And again, so far we've engaged in looking at voting, the history of voting rights, the history of freedom of speech. We've just completed some work on the history of immigration policy, and very shortly, race and racism in American history, all of which, again, are part of the civic dialogue that I think is so important that, students, parents, politicians, everybody should engage in. So that's sort of the motivation that we've engaged in. John, you want to add to that?
I would just, say ditto, and then add from a more pedagogical lens. What we've been trying to do is how do you engage students, and try to encourage them to be more civic minded. And the approach that we've used for all of these units is a teaching for thinking, learning by thinking approach. And it's basically, structured along 4 different principles. The first one is framing whatever lesson, whatever units that we've been researching and writing with a series of thought-provoking, evaluative, essential questions. Now, why would we want to do that? Because when you question, and if we all think about this just for a very quick moment, when somebody poses a question to you, we immediately start thinking, almost involuntarily. And if you can apply that very simplistic principle to classroom instruction, what if whatever you were going to cover, all right, frame and focus it in the form of a thought-provoking, evaluative question. In other words, don't cover content. Provide students with a framework in which they can discover rather than merely cover. And then, with that, in my view, if every day you are framing what we are doing in the classroom with a thought-provoking, evaluative question, you're encouraging students to think. And you're encouraging students then to use evidence and discussion and writing to draw conclusions about whatever issue is being posed in that essential question. And that is being civic-minded, because therefore I can convert or transform my classroom into a laboratory of democracy, where every day I, as a student, am being challenged by my teacher to develop a viewpoint or take a position on a certain historical issue or question. And those skills of developing, decisions and drawing conclusions, when we talk about lifelong learning, I can utilize my classroom every day for lifelong learning by asking and challenging students, through information, through evidence, through discussion, to draw conclusions about important and relevant issues. And I think if a student then is used to making decisions every day based on evidence, based on discussion, based on the exchange of information, then I think we are promoting a very civic-minded person. And we are encouraging them to make decisions, not off the top of my head, but rather on evidence, through discussion, through reason, and then ultimately to draw conclusions.
I love that approach for a multitude of reasons, but one, we're teaching students that, again, history isn't this fixed narrative, that it is a series of different events and perspectives that have happened, and how you piece that story together is what creates narratives. And so I think as we are looking, to open doors to a more inclusive society, and then also a more inclusive historical narrative that we've presented, in American history, essential questions are a great way to open that door. But to your second point, John, I think you hit the nail on the head in regards to, in order to inform citizens who are able to look at something, question it, seek out resources and evidence, and then corroborate all of those sources to come up with an opinion, is what our country needs. And it's something I think that has been lacking in our civil discourse. And I like to tell students that, exercising your citizenship, it's a muscle. It's something that you perpetually have to keep attuned. Otherwise, it's very easy for, your citizenship just to sit on the couch and eat potato chips all day, but that's not good for our democracy. So I am curious, in developing these units, how did you come up with the starting point that you wanted to focus on voting rights?
Well, real quick, and John, you can jump in after I, kind of frame this. We wanted to go to an expert. Okay, so we know every one of our units. We've been privileged to find, a scholar who wants to work with students for the voting rights. We reached out to. I'm going brain dead here. Alan, help me out, John. I'm going.
Oh, Alan Lichtman.
Alan Lichtman. Okay. I hate when that happens. But so Alan Lichtman, if anybody's not familiar with him, he's a historian and a interpreter of elections for a long time. He is, again, a go-to person for the perspective. So we reached out to Alan, and we said, hey, here's where we want to go. We want to take a look broadly at what's happened in terms of voting rights. And again, he said, well, that's an interesting point. So, maybe you want to start framing, is voting a right or a privilege? And then we started, doing the research, and we, in consultation with Alan, we looked back in time and we went forward in time. And what we found was kind of interesting and shocking in some ways, in the sense that the founding fathers didn't really care that much about when they were discussing the Constitution. It only took about 1% of their time up, talking about voting. And it was very limited. And, the first election, for example, only 6% of the eligible male voters voted. So there's a lot of things that were there. And then over time, we took a look, and again, over, with documents and looking at, the perspective. So we broke the lesson up into two parts, from the founding era to the end of the 19th century, the Jim Crow era. And then, from the 1900 to, into the 21st century. But again, the way we frame the lesson, John's always good with words, tensions, twists and turns, the development and evolution of voting rights. So, it's not, again, as John pointed out when he was discussing essential questions, it's not a straight line. It's sort of, all over the place in terms of development, and sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in very negative ways. And again, I guess, if nothing else, that raises a lot of essential questions right there. So some good things to just think about in terms of what we did. And again, like when we drill down, we looked for documents that, again, teachers would not normally be familiar with. And that's the other part of what we try to do. I mean, obviously, there's important things that you need. You need the Constitution. You need the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. You need some of the other amendments, to talk about that development. But very importantly, there's some other documents. John, you may want to talk about the Pennsylvania document of 1838.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, just picking up on what Ron said, when we approach the research and the writing and the teaching of these units, there's basically four components. One, there's an ascent, and they're all interconnected if we really think about it. So, for example, the first component, we want to focus and frame it with a thought-provoking essential question. So we use things like, to what extent should voting be viewed as a privilege, a right, and or a duty for Americans? And if you look at the history, all right, going back to colonial and even revolutionary times, voting was viewed as a privilege for certain people who had a certain income, for certain people who were of a certain gender, for certain people who were of a certain race, for certain people who owned a certain amount of property. And then over time, all right, that evolved from privilege into a right. So by the age of Andrew Jackson, where the nation now, these states are abolishing all of these different religious property and income qualifications, it's universal manhood suffrage, but not for women and not for Blacks. And that therefore, we then wanted to continue the story through the Civil War. So when Ron said the 1838 appeal of 40,000 African Americans in the state of Pennsylvania made an appeal to the state legislature in 1838 because they had the right to vote. And then under the new Constitution of 1838, they lost the right to vote. And that's an important concept that we wanted to drive home to students. Under the Constitution, most of the power concerning regulations and procedures for voting, as we now know with the most recent election, has been left to the states. And that therefore it wasn't until the Civil War with the 14th and the 15th Amendments that the federal government began to exercise muscle in creating guidelines and mandates that you could not deprive somebody of their right to vote because of race, for African American men. So it evolved. But then they gained the right to vote, but then a few decades later, they lose the right to vote through the Jim Crow legislation. So one of the things that we really wanted to make students to see, to be civic minded, is you can gain the right to vote and you can lose the right to vote. And then African Americans and others regain the right to vote, at least legally, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that was one of the things that we wanted to emphasize. The other thing is having students think broadly, to what extent have American governments and their policies reflected the will of the people? And if you look at that over time, it depends on how you define the people. Are you defining people only as white? Are you defining people only as male? Are you defining people in whatever ways that that they did? So we wanted to take students through a little bit of a journey, one, to help them understand that You can win the right to vote and have the right to vote, but you can lose the right to vote. And if you're not vigilant, and then you then can work hard to regain the right to vote. And then the other thing was, how do we define the will of the people over time? And to do that, just one more sentence. We basically designed every unit with 4 components. One, as I said, was a thought-provoking menu of essential questions that teachers could select from, whatever they think is the most appropriate. 2, giving students a selection and teachers a selection of visual and textual primary sources that they could select from. All that would fall under the umbrella of the essential question, because the essential question determines what sources I'm going to utilize. And then the primary sources get kids into a flavor of the past. They put kids into a spectator's role. They're in the moment. Thirdly, would be, because primary sources can at times be difficult and challenging, providing students with different types of graphic organizers that would facilitate their understanding and discussion of the text or the vision of the primary sources. And then finally, something that I always used to ask myself every single day when I created a lesson. There's basically 4 literacy skills that we want to enhance: reading, reasoning, speaking, writing. And taking a step back when I design a lesson and asking myself, which we did when we wrote these units, to what extent are we giving students opportunities to read, to reason, to speak, and to write? And that's basically the approach, sorry for going on too long, about how we approached whether the unit was voting rights, whether it was free speech, whether it was immigration, or whether it was racism and race relations.
And just to follow up very quickly with what John was saying, John says reading, and I say reading, but you can read a text, you could read a song, you could read a cartoon, a political cartoon. You could, again, what we've tried to do then, I guess, is basically at the end of the day, find a variety of interdisciplinary ways to approach, not just, hey, we're going to read the Constitution, which is important. Don't get me wrong, but but let's listen to somebody's musical composition. Let's analyze somebody's political cartoon or painting. Let's look at other ways of again, political the primary sources being delivered, sometimes overlooked. Again, people, they overlook the obvious and they don't see, oh, there's an important connection here. I know we were talking real quickly last night. I mean, I'm going to jump real quickly and then I'll let you go back to questioning. But I mean, we're doing a race and racism unit. So, oh, by the way, there's a lot of things that are overlooked. So we've included musical compositions like, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. Well, there's something there, in terms of understanding late 20th century, race and racism issues in a musical piece, there. But you can go back in time and, we go forward in time, all over the place in terms of looking for ways to connect students, engage students, excite students, to find way and to answer those essential questions. So, anyway.
I think that's such a brilliant approach, because history is all about people, and to steal Facing History's kind of tagline is that, people make choices, choices make history. And so if you can bring in the humanity of people for students to connect with, it doesn't feel so far away. When you're talking about things that have happened 200 or 100 years ago. And one of the ways in which to do that is to bring in popular culture as a way to connect with them, because it's something familiar for them to look at. And, I know that your organization has been, instrumental in bringing Hamilton into the classrooms and things like that. And so it's always just something that I have revered from afar, of what a brilliant way to get students excited about history and make those connections that what people do and what people create through art and music and photography, and writing matters. It's a snapshot of time and can be used as a primary resource.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious. I mean, you took on some really big, issues of voting rights and racism and immigration. Do you feel like these units are complete, or does it just open more doors to be explored?
No, nothing's ever complete, obviously. I mean, there wouldn't be, I was just looking today, by the way, shout out to the Gettysburg Address today, right? So November 19th, it's 1863. So there's only been 2 books written about Lincoln. Right? So there's 16,000 books about Lincoln. So the question is why? Because there's always new essential questions. There's always new ways, new perspectives. So absolutely, the quick answer is nothing's ever complete. Mm-hmm. So, as we've assumed, we'll open the door for students and teachers, to start to think about these things, and hopefully they'll run with the door open. So, yeah.
And on that like topic, if I could apply it to the classroom, Rebecca, one of the challenges that Ron and I had was, what do you include and what do you omit? What do you emphasize and highlight, and what might be left out? And that's the same challenge that every teacher faces every single day. There's a 1,000-page textbook and there's a 30-page, chapter 17 in the book. And what do you highlight and what do you include? And I think a really good way to help everybody, teachers, because I know it's helped me tremendously. The essential question drives those choices and decisions. Because once you have the essential question, here's another question that I found always works. Once I have the essential question and I have, let's say, chapter 17 or several different topics, and I want to decide, gee, what should I include? What should I emphasize? What should I highlight? Here's the question that will help you and I make those decisions. Asking yourself, I will say this slowly, what information do the students need to know to develop a viewpoint on that essential question? And if the textual or visual resources help the students and provide information to develop a viewpoint, then it's in. If it doesn't, it's out. And it took me quite a while when I first started teaching. I felt that I had to teach everything because that was my responsibility. And it took me a few years to recognize, no, that is not my responsibility. My responsibility, as we said earlier, is teaching in a way to promote students to think and encouraging them and promoting them to learn through their thinking. And that's why the essential question is so crucial and so pivotal. And the essential question, by asking yourself what information do students need to know to develop a viewpoint on that essential question, that stimulates in every teacher's head what I need to include and what do I need to omit. And then knowing what visual textual documents that you want, that then will help you determine what kind of graphic organizers do you want to provide to students to facilitate their understanding of the documents. And knowing that will give you insights on what kind of reading skills, reasoning skills, speaking skills, writing skills do you want to emphasize in the lesson. So the driver for all of this, under the umbrella of teaching for thinking and learning by thinking, is the essential question. Because by knowing the essential question, that helps teachers make better decisions about content and about graphic organizers and about what kind of literacy skills that every single lesson will be promoting. So that was kind of our guideposts, for both of us along the way. The essential questions were the driver. And now you can look at it from the other perspective too, very, very quickly. If you have certain documents that you want to highlight in your lesson, then ask yourself, what question or issue is being raised from those documents, and put that, and then phrase that in the form of a thought-provoking, evaluative question. And one of the things that we included today, I think is on a link that you're going to receive. There's a list of about 165 essential questions. It's a menu. It's not meant to be followed one by one by one. You have your own essential questions. Some of them may be a whole lot better than the ones that are on this list. But what's on this list are questions that promote students to make choices and decisions. And we have one for U.S. history. The second one, we like focus on something to go into a little bit greater depth. Having the essential question, there's a list of essential questions from 1900 down through the New Deal, the emergence of the American nation, and then it has the documents that would apply to each essential question. And then there's one in there for world history, because we didn't want to leave out anybody who's teaching world history.
No, I really appreciate that. I'm also going to put in the chat right now, as you're discussing, if you are new to teaching through essential questions, ultimately you're teaching historical thinking. It's bringing the practice of being a historian into your classroom. And there is a great book that I always tell teachers to start with, which is Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, Charting the Future of Teaching of the Past by Sam Weinberg. So I'll put the title in the chat. It's a great resource for you to really just kind of wrap your head around if you currently don't teach, using through essential questions. Well, we only have a few minutes left. The time always whizzes by so quickly. So I'll let our audience members know that if you have a question that you would like to ask Ron or John, please feel free to either put it in the chat or you can use the Q&A feature. But, my question as we kind of wrap things up, if you could bring it down to one key point, why is this type of teaching so important at this moment in time? And we'll start with Ron.
Well, again, I think if anybody's in the audience who's heard me speak before, I always go back to an anecdote, a quick one that I learned when I was a graduate student, that the root word of history is historia, Greek word, which means inquiry, to ask questions. And I think that's been the main theme that we've been talking about during the course of this, this session. But always making the connection between the past, the present, I think is important. And I'll leave with, one other connection that we've made in the race unit. Ida Wells, somebody, in the audience may be familiar with her or not. But, when she was working as an investigative reporter, she did a story about an event. It seemed so small, but now, we take a look at it. In 1900, there was an episode called the Robert Charles Murder. It was an event. I'm just going to be a teaser here. So you got to go out and look for it now, but it'll be in our unit. But Robert Charles is this guy sitting on a stoop in New Orleans in 1900, and he gets jostled by some police officers. And eventually what happens is a shooting. He shoots the police, they shoot his partner who's sitting there with him. And what happens, obviously, is, you could make an argument. It's very similar to some things that are happening today. So again, it's Ida Wells talking about it as an investigative reporter, but then in the process of asking questions, I found a Jelly Roll Morton jazz song about the event, which was very not known, limited because it was written for the African-American audience, and they didn't really share it with the larger audience. So but the Library of Congress has this, and so you ask questions and you find stuff and you expand on this, and all of a sudden, wow, something that seems so small, as an event suddenly becomes that much larger because it definitely connects to the present. So anyway, for what that's worth.
Great, John. How about you? Why is this so?
Briefly, I would just say that one thing about history is it's something that everybody can share because we all have a personal history and a family history. We all have a township and local history. We all have a state history, and we all have a national history. We all have a global history. And there's certainly, if you want to understand what life is all about, my life personally, the life of family, the life of our city, state, nation, country, learning about history is the passport, quote unquote, to gaining a better understanding. And finally, I just want to reiterate, one of the challenges that we hear from students is, well, history is boring. It happened several hundred years ago. It's fact-oriented. So my way of thinking is, instead of making it fact-oriented and factual recall, once again covering content, putting it in the form of a thought-provoking, evaluative, not just a thought-provoking issue, but a thought-provoking, evaluative issue that encourages students, and then requiring them that it's your job in my classroom by the end of the period. You have to have a viewpoint based on evidence, based on your reasoning, based on discussion. And I really think that that will help alleviate the boredom and the remoteness. Because if I can just reiterate the very simplistic process, but it's so true. When you pose a question to somebody, they start involuntarily thinking. When they start thinking, they become engaged. When they start becoming engaged, they are finding things interesting. And when they find things interesting, they're probably going to learn more. And with that simple principle, I based my whole teaching career on that. And now with Gilder Lehrman, everything that I do, I keep reminding myself of that. Design things where you're giving teachers the opportunity to teach students for their thinking, and provide students with opportunities so that they can learn by thinking. And that, I think, is helping students to be civic minded. It's also, in this very volatile time, teaching students tolerance, because essential questions normally have more than one viewpoint. And when students in the classroom express, whether in writing or orally, there is a diversity of viewpoints. And I think essential questions can be a way to train students every day to have a greater tolerance of different points of view. Because if they're seeing that in their classroom every day, maybe they'll be a little more tolerant about American society, especially in times of elections.
I could not agree anymore. As a historian and as a museum professional, I am a firm believer that our complicated history informs our shared present, which shapes our collective future. And, that's what your work is doing here. It's tying all of those pieces together. So, as a colleague and as a professional, thank you so much for your dedication and work that you do. And, helping teachers during these times to really make an impact with students in regards to being civically minded and, embracing our complex histories. And for those in the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. Please, I encourage you to check out Gilder Lehrman's website. It is a wealth of resources and amazing teacher professional development. And Ron and John are just two wonderful humans. So thank you so much for being here with us today.